Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Colonel Cindy Jebb, the Deputy and Acting Head in the Department of Social Sciences at West Point, which means I have the obligation to say that what I'm about to say does not represent the views of the Department of Defense, Department of the Army, and West Point. They're my views. I know Peter Bergen wanted to be here to welcome everybody as he serves as the Director of National Security Studies Program here at the New America Foundation. He was called away for a briefing. As you might know, the release of the Afghan progress report from the administration is out today, and I think they're briefing all the journalists now before President Obama does officially release at 10 o'clock, I believe, is when that's scheduled. Hopefully, Peter will be able to join us midstream, and he'll serve as discussant. If he does come in, we have a spot for him should he come back. We are very excited to be here. I'm also representing the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, and I'm delighted to be here to meet up again with Brian Fishman, who was with us, just left, I guess, 18 months ago. And, of course, Asaf Mogadam, who is actually leaving us now, headed to the Louder School in Israel. I want to begin briefly by just mentioning the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, because even those in the Army ask, what is it? And why is it at West Point? And I want to talk about that a little bit. We stood the center up in 2003 and with the mission to conduct research, to educate, and to provide policy expertise to future and present leaders. And the strength of the center is really its people, and we've really had a great opportunity to attract people from all walks of life, supporters from all walks of life, who are now serving in different capacities at the center. One of them, we'll call him our founding father, is Vinny Viola, who provided the initial funding support and continues to do so, along with Ross Perot and many others. It is a privately funded center. General Russ Howard was the department head at the time, and General Wayne Downing was our first chair at the center. Currently, General John Abizade is our chair, and we have great access and leverage to the policy community through our senior fellows, who include Bruce Hoffman, Michelle Malvesti, and Ambassador Mike Sheehan. Reed Sawyer, who's the director of the center, is hopefully landing in Afghanistan as we speak. He's going to be looking at issues of corruption, and our department head, Mike Meese, has been serving as General Petraeus' Deputy Chief of Staff for the year. So that's another actually great strength of the center, is that we do engage with the commanders of the combatant commands to help provide perspective and also understand the threat after next in a very fast-moving environment. Having said that, we're not an intelligence node. Our comparative advantage is to provide the contextual analysis that operational commands really, frankly, don't have the time to do. The CTC itself is composed of about 20 members. Most of them reside in the Department of Social Sciences at West Point, which really provides the context, the political, economic, social, cultural context in which to study terrorism. But we also have an opportunity to leverage the faculty both in the department and around West Point, which is a great advantage. While we've always taught lessons and courses in terrorism, it really wasn't until 2001 that we realized there was a huge gap in terrorism studies, especially at the undergraduate level. The topic really requires a multidisciplinary approach with multiple perspectives from the practitioner, policy, and academic worlds. And that really wasn't happening, and we wanted to serve as a bridge to gap those worlds, to close the gap among those worlds, to ensure that we were approaching the study of terrorism systematically, critically, and creatively. And from this, we wanted to better anticipate behaviors and therefore better inform policy, advise practitioners, and provide future leaders with the intellectual courage to ask uncomfortable questions. So the answer to the immediate question the immediate answer to the question of why is the CTC at West Point, it really stems from our immediate constituencies, and that are those cadets, as well as the junior rotating military faculty. Those folks we pull in right after their company command, send them to graduate school, and then they teach and mentor, professionally develop, and then go back out, and they're the ones stepping into senior leader positions. Today, the world is not just complicated, as a New York Times op-ed had recently said, but it's complex, meaning that everyone and everything is connected. We need leaders who are not just problem solvers, but can help identify new problem sets, which is increasingly more challenging. Quite frankly, this includes junior leaders, as we know that the security environment is so different from valley to valley, village to village, much less country to country. We also offer a suite of courses to other security professionals to include FBI, NYPD, FDNY, and many others. And as I mentioned, we like to be that natural bridge to ensure we're collaborating with experts and studying the problem from all different perspectives. The report that Brian and Asaf are going to summarize for you reflects that analytical rigor, that integrity, and that holistic approach that the CTC and the New America Foundation prize. It identifies those new problem sets I discussed earlier, but then also offers a way ahead. Specifically, the report asks those uncomfortable questions while challenging assumptions and conventional thinking. Indeed, it also approaches the study with humility, incorporates varying perspectives as evidenced by the terrific lineup of truly international contributors. It offers what a friend of mine calls a small ball approach to counterterrorism, this idea that you only win baseball games through bunts and steals and singles, not with the home run. As a Met fan, I'm not a credible speaker of the small ball strategy, although I watch a lot of losing games from a team that doesn't employ it. The authors acknowledge that there is no home run for countering terrorism, only dogged hard work and understanding the problem, identifying those new problem sets, and updating and reevaluating one's knowledge and perspective. Some of the uncomfortable questions they ask include, is terrorism everywhere a threat to U.S. interests? How do we evaluate the threat? How do we understand al-Qa'ida? If it's not achieving its strategic goals, how does it remain operationally capable? And if it's operationally capable, why isn't it achieving its strategic objectives? While it would seem that its internal divisions would necessarily make al-Qa'ida weaker, why is it so resilient? And this is the focus of the report, that is, these internal divisions. How do we understand them, and what do they matter? Interestingly here, too, what may seem a huge ramifications of divisions concerning strategic issues, we actually see huge opportunities from a CT perspective to exploit tactical level divisions. How do we anticipate and understand the implications of al-Qa'ida's evolutions and its connections and influence on its associated movements and its affiliates, and vice versa? This study provides not only insight on these important questions, but I think it serves as an inspiration to all of us to engage in deeper and systematic study of these important issues. So hopefully, a year from now, we're not asking ourselves, who is the threat? I'm quite haunted, frankly, by an article several months ago in the New York Times that quoted Marine General Nichols during the operations in Helmand, where he essentially, and rightfully, I would add, says that we no longer know who we're fighting. We who study terrorism need to do better. We owe it to the cadets, and we owe it to the nation. Assisting us towards that better understanding is Brian Fishman and Asaf Moghadam, and hopefully Peter Bergen, if he's able to come back after the briefing. And actually, it's a little poignant that he's coming here after the briefing, and maybe we'll get some insights as to the report that he'll share with us. Let me first give you a brief intro to Asaf Moghadam, who's going to kick off the panel. Asaf is the outgoing Director of Terrorism Studies at the Combating Terrorism Center, and he's been an assistant professor at West Point's Department of Social Sciences, teaching courses in international relations, terrorism and counterterrorism, and the Advanced Terrorism Seminar. He's the author of 2 books, The Globalization of Martyrdom, al-Qaeda, Salafi Jihad, and the Diffusion of Suicide Attacks, as well as The Roots of Terrorism. He is the editor of a forthcoming book, Militancy and Political Violence in Shiism, Trends and Patterns, and he's co-editor, actually stemming from this, with Brian on a forthcoming volume, Fault Lines in Global Jihad, Organizational, Strategic, and Ideological Fissures. He's lectured widely across the world, actually. He's a leading expert on suicide terrorism. He serves on the editorial board of Studies in Conflict and Terrorism and Democracy and Security. He's written numerous chapters and articles that have appeared in all kinds of journals and newspapers and other publications. He's had several fellowships with Harvard. He's got his PhD and master's from the Fletcher School. He's headed to the Lauder School of Government Diplomacy and Strategy in Israel. So I'm going to turn it over to Asaf to get us started.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Colonel Jeb. First of all, I really would like to thank the New America Foundation for hosting us, and especially Brian Fishman for being great connector here, and really one of the smartest things that I've done as part of this volume is to ask Brian to co-edit this volume with me, and it really, I mean, it's been a tremendous. This volume would not have been as good as it is, I believe, without Brian's help. So thanks, and thank you also for Colonel Jebb for your great remarks, and indeed thank you to all my colleagues at the Social Science Department and the Combating Terrorism Center. Really, one of the hardest working group that I know. The way that we are going to divide this talk, Brian and I will start by attempting to say what we try to accomplish with the study, how we framed our analysis, some of our guiding assumptions, and I will also highlight two of our key findings. And since I've spent about 3 years at West Point now, let me start with the bluff, or as they say it in military speak, the bottom line up front. Let me give you the two key findings first. The first key finding is that jihadi divisions have weakened the movement, but not in an automatic or an exclusive fashion. So even though the net impact of divisions within and around the jihadis on their movement is negative, the jihadi movement is resilient. It's resilient to some of these divisions. The second finding is that jihadi divisions matter, but in different ways. What does that mean? It means some divisions matter more than others. It also means that some divisions matter more for some jihadi audiences than for others. And I will talk about these, of course, in greater detail. And Brian will afterwards delve, I think, more into into some additional findings, and mostly the implications of the study for policy, including on Afghanistan. So let me start by talking a little bit about how Brian and I attempted, what Brian and I attempted to accomplish with this report. Our starting point really is that terrorism scholars have concluded that in recent years, al-Qa'ida has weakened, and the jihadi movement at large really has substantially weakened. And I think that the new strategy report that came out of the administration today would confirm this. Al-Qa'ida, as we know, has lost operational capacities. Some of its franchises have weakened or have been defeated altogether. Many ideological challenges have been posed from Muslims towards al-Qa'ida, including from a number of very prominent jihadis. Al-Qa'ida, in short, has been unable to achieve most of its policy goals, and its capabilities have eroded. Some of its capabilities have eroded. Now, there is no doubt in our mind that Western and allied CT efforts have contributed to the decline, but an underexplored issue, as far as we are concerned, is the extent to which debates and divisions within the jihadi movement that are unrelated to the external CT efforts have actually hastened the decline of the jihadi movement. To that end, we wanted to compile a report that would look systematically and comprehensively at what we termed the endogenous problems of the jihadis. And by that we mean debates and divisions both within the jihadi movement itself, but also those between jihadis and other Muslims, other Muslim and Islamist actors, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, or Shias. A look at the jihadis' internal problems, we believe, is important because despite the weakening of the jihadi movement, al-Qa'ida, its affiliates, and its associates remain adaptive, resilient, and ingenious. And there are a couple of just recent examples which I think support that belief. Is if we look, for example, at the attempt to kill the AQAP, al-Qa'ida in the Islamic in the Arabian Peninsula, the plot to blow up Assistant Interior Minister of Saudi Arabia, Prince Mohammed bin Nayef, using a device that was hidden in the bomber's body. Last year's Christmas Day plot by Omar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, or the attack in Khost against 7 CIA operatives. These attacks are just, or the recent package bombings, of course. So these attacks actually suggest that al-Qa'ida still has the capability to inflict damage on the United States and its allies. In addition, jihadis have proven resistant to ideological challenges, and some franchises actually have been strengthening, like the ones in Yemen or in Somalia. So in other words, al-Qa'ida is not dead yet, but perhaps we can accelerate its decline if we can try to understand its weak spots, and that's exactly what we try to do, is to push the debate of understanding jihadi weaknesses forward. We need to acknowledge that we are not the first ones to examine this topic, and we've benefited from the work of several scholars in this regard, including Fawaz Gurgis and our colleague Vahid Brown, who have done really valuable and excellent work. Our goal, however, was a bit more ambitious. It was to provide the most comprehensive and systematic discussion of this topic to date, while also trying to tackle some of the really critical policy questions that I think some others have shunned. These include, do these divisions really matter? Do some divisions matter more than others? Can and should we exploit these divisions? And if so, how? To that end, we're also fortunate to gather some of the leading experts on this topic, Mohammed Hafiz, Stephen Brooke, Vahid Brown, Brynja Leah, Ann Stenerson, Mark Lynch, Reuven Paz, and Bernard Haeckel. And we thank them really for their wonderful contributions. So before I go and present some of the ways in which we framed our report and some of our findings, I think some definitions are going to be in order. So we define the global jihad movement in a nutshell as a transnational entity of like-minded Sunni militants. They're like-minded because they agree on the broad contours of a religious ideology that believes in the necessity to wage an armed struggle, what they call a jihad, against a set of actors that they believe have conspired to attack Islam. It is a global jihad movement because this movement rejects international borders, but also because it speaks on behalf of a transnational community of believers, the Islamic Ummah, and because it perceives its enemies to be part of a broad conspiracy that transcends state borders. The movement is led by al-Qa'ida, but it also consists of al-Qa'ida affiliates and al-Qa'ida associates. By affiliates, we mean groups that have more formal ties to al-Qa'ida and who sometimes even would adopt its name, like al-Qa'ida in the Arabian Peninsula. And by associates, we mean associated individuals, networks, and groups, which are really actors that may lack formal ties, that may lack the formal ties of an affiliate, but who are influenced by the religious ideology that al-Qa'ida propagates. We do not include in our definition of jihadis such groups as the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, or Hezbollah, to which we refer simply as Islamists. Although the Muslim Brotherhood shares certain goals with al-Qa'ida, its primary approach is not a violent one. As far as Hamas is concerned, Hamas is singularly focused on liberating Palestine, and hence does not adopt the global aspirations of the jihadis. Hezbollah, of course, is a Shia actor, and as such, by definition, is excluded from what is a Sunni Islamist movement. We realize that some would challenge the distinctions that we draw between jihadists and Islamists, but we believe that this report actually demonstrates very clearly not only that jihadis and other Islamists need to be distinguished, but also that they are deeply divided with important implications for counterterrorism policy, which Brian, I think, will talk about in more detail. The jihadis' endogenous problems, we argue, are composed of two parts, as I said. The first is internal jihadi divisions, such as issues issues such as tactics, strategy, or power. The second is divisions between jihadis and other Muslims, ranging from Islamist groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood to Hamas and Hezbollah, but even larger Muslim communities, even as the Shia writ large. Now, it seems quite obvious why internal jihadi divisions over strategy and tactics might be called endogenous problems, but one might reasonably wonder why we included among the jihadis' endogenous problems also those divisions between jihadis and other Islamist actors, such as the MB and Hamas. The reason for that is simply because jihadis purport to represent the Islamic Ummah at large. They claim to speak on their behalf, and they appeal to Muslims in their public statements and pronouncements. For jihadis, Muslims essentially form a single group. And even if some members in that group are believed to have deviated from the true tenets of Islam, jihadis would really love for these nominal Muslims to convert, so to speak, to jihadism. Failure to do so constitutes a problem for the jihadis, and deep divisions between jihadis and other Muslim or Islamist actors are a great part of the reason for this failure. So let me talk now about how we framed this study. So going into this study, we, and by we I mean the co-editors, we assumed that the most critical fault lines within and around the jihadis revolve around 7 issues, namely ideology, goals, enemy, strategy, tactics, organizational structure, and power. Or, in other words, the jihadis' endogenous problems revolve around 7 questions. Who are we? What do we want? Who are we fighting? How do we succeed? What are legitimate means and targets in this fight? How do we organize ourselves? And who will lead us? Going into this study, we assume that division or lack of clarity on any one of these questions must have an exclusively debilitating effect on the movement. And most of these divisions have debilitating effects on the movement. But one of the counterintuitive findings of this volume is that some divisions help render the movement more resilient. To illustrate this point, I will just briefly discuss in more detail 2 of these 7 sources of divisions, namely divisions over goals and divisions over who is the enemy. So we in the West, we generally abide by a sort of rationalist tradition that assumes that having clarity when it comes to goals and who's the enemy is extremely important. That, for example, is why many have criticized President George W. Bush's GWAT strategy, because they argued that the enemy is not narrowly enough conceived. So we in the West, we apply our assumption that there have to be clear conceptions of goals and enemy also to terrorist organizations. We believe that terrorist organizations must set clear objectives in order for the group members to know what they're fighting for, and in order for the organization to justify why group members have to sacrifice themselves. For that reason, we are encouraged by the fact that jihadis seem to have a problem figuring out exactly what they want and expressing very clearly who it is that they're actually fighting. So let me just give a few examples of the jihadis' lack of clarity on these issues. When it comes to the goals, for example, and I'm sure most of us know this, as far as the ultimate goals are concerned, the jihadis are not really clear whether what they want is the establishment of the caliphate, the end of foreign occupation of Muslim lands, is it perhaps personal religious salvation of its members, or is it perhaps retribution against the West that they seek? And in addition, some of these sub-goals are actually very vaguely defined. So let's look at the establishment of the caliphate, for example. There is really, one gets very little sense from the jihadis about how would such a caliphate look like, how will it be achieved, where is its seat, and who will be its leader. Descriptions of the enemy are equally inconsistent. Jihadis alternatively mention the U.S., Crusaders, Zionism, global unbelief, Jews, and even the international order among its list of enemies. And of course, they also add the apostates into the mix. And they also debate whether to focus their battle on the near enemy or the far enemy. So, given our prevailing Western rationalist assumptions that strong organizations need to have clear goals and clear conceptions of who they're fighting, coupled with the fact that jihadis seem very confused about what their goals are and who their enemy is, on the face of it, this would seem like very good news to us. We'd like to believe that if jihadis are occupied figuring out what it is that they really want and who their main enemy is, they would have less time at their disposal to plot attacks against the West. But the truth, however, is unfortunately more complicated, because the fact that jihadis have broad conceptions of their goals and their enemies also works in their favor. If jihadis had set specific goals, for example, they would run the risk of alienating current or potential members who might agree with the group's overall stance, but dissent from some of its more specific goals. In other words, keeping goals abstract can be useful for jihadis because it allows a wide range of jihadis to define the meaning behind these goals for themselves. And the same goes for descriptions of the enemy. Our first instinct when it comes to the enemy is that diverging views among jihadis of the enemy must hurt the jihadis. And indeed, they do. They confuse the process of building and implementing a strategy that is capable of defeating any one of these enemies. Without a clear organizational hierarchy and with a vague description of the enemy, jihadi resources are expended in various directions. But here too, there is a flip side. This approach allows a wide range of Muslims with varied grievances to latch onto the jihadi message. And so it gives a wide range of groups and individuals access to the jihadi project by allowing them to turn their particular boogeyman into a jihadi enemy. So these 2 examples serve to illustrate what is perhaps the overarching finding of our study, that jihadi divisions matter, and to repeat, the net impact of these divisions is negative for the jihadis. But they do not weaken this movement in an automatic or in an exclusive fashion. While the jihadi movement is vulnerable to divisions in many ways, it is resilient to them in some other ways. In fact, some divisions even enhance jihadi resilience by preventing ideological or kinetic CT efforts from damaging the entire movement in one fell swoop. And herein lies one important reason for the ambivalent effect of jihadi divisions, namely in the movement's structural characteristics. The fact is that the global jihad movement consists of multiple layers of overlapping organizations, media arms, terrorist entities, and geographic branches. And this structure has both costs and benefits for jihadis. On the cost side, from the perspective of the jihadis, the sheer multitude of organizations that compose the global jihad movement any of which can suffer from tactical, strategic, or ideological divisions, results in a high total number of fault lines that can weaken the jihadis on a number of fronts. But then again, the jihadis benefit from this structure. For the variety of overlapping networks, identities, functions, and geographic concentrations that make up the movement, allow jihadis to absorb divisions on one level without these divisions necessarily affecting another level. Divisions in one regional affiliate, for example, might not carry over to another affiliate. Disputes over the merits of a particular attack may weaken a local organization, but could benefit the movement as a whole if al-Qaeda's media arm can portray the attack as effective and as legitimate. In other words, as my friend Brian has aptly once put it to me, there is no al-Qaeda Death Star. Oh, that was great.
Thank you.
I hope I didn't steal your thunder. We reach a similar finding that divisions are mostly harmful for the jihadis, but also afford certain advantages to the group, also with respect to divisions between jihadis and other Muslims and Islamist groups. On the one hand, jihadis are in a bad position to quarrel with groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, or Hezbollah, because these movements have far deeper social bases and provide social services to their constituents or avenues to participate in democratic processes. But at the same time, precisely because jihadis are the least powerful group especially when compared with the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, or Hezbollah, they also enjoy the benefits of the underdog, so to speak. Their constituents have relatively low expectations about the jihadis' ability to produce immediate victories. In addition, the jihadis' recalcitrance in both word and deed affords them a higher degree of credibility among more extremist members of the Ummah. Conflict with other Islamist groups rarely strengthens the global jihadis. But these quarrels, they can help jihadi organizations raise their profile within the wider jihadi movement. They can help attract rhetorical and financial support, and they can rally jihadi supporters who are frustrated by what they consider the apostasy of more traditional Islamists. Let me now briefly discuss the second key finding before turning it over to Brian. The second key finding of ours is that jihadi fault lines matter, but in different ways. What do we mean? For example, some divisions seem more consequential than others. Divisions over strategies and tactics tend to be more damaging to jihadis than dissent over goals and views of the enemy. This is because strategies and tactics have to be defined in relatively concrete terms. You cannot sort of target Shias or sort of behead people. You can either decide to do it or decide not to do it. And when you do, you are liable to create disunity in your ranks because some jihadis will think that killing Shiites or behead infidels is counterproductive. Few, of course, will think it is wrong as a matter of principle. Goals and enemies, on the other hand, can be defined broadly. And as we saw, this abstract conception of goals and enemies comes at little cost to the jihadis and sometimes even benefits them. They also allow for greater flexibility in the face of pressure or setback in a single area. So what are the implications of that for CT? The fact that divisions over strategy and tactics matter more than divisions over goals and enemy. The implications are quite simply that highlighting jihadi divisions over strategies and tactics is probably more valuable than highlighting the fact that jihadis are confused about goals and enemies, an insight that can potentially help save us valuable time and money. Another example of how jihadi divisions matter, but in different ways, relates to their impact on different jihadi audiences. Divisions over grand strategy, for example, have greater potential to divide the leadership of jihadi organizations, but have less of an impact over the jihadi rank and file, at least in the short run. Divisions over tactics, on the other hand, affect not only the leadership, but also the jihadi rank and file, because tactical divisions oftentimes have immediate results on the ground. Thus, divisions over tactics, for example, have the potential to shove the jihadis further away to the margins of the Islamic community. Leadership debates over broader strategic questions, on the other hand, can pose direct threats to jihadi groups themselves, but do not necessarily marginalize al-Qaeda and its cohorts further from the mainstream. What's the value here for counterterrorism? First, it helps manage our expectations. It also suggests that when attempting to exploit divisions over tactics, we should think about whether it's valuable for us to collaborate with the jihadis' Islamist competitors, who can help us marginalize the jihadis even further. Divisions over strategy, meanwhile, are probably most damaging when expressed by jihadists themselves. arguably, for instance, strategic dissent regarding the wisdom of the 9/11 attacks on part of the group around Saif al-Adil may have served as a catalyst for the break of al-Qaeda senior leadership into a group based in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and another one in Iran. So we believe that our findings have important implications for policy, which Brian will talk about in more detail. The fact that let me just close by saying that the fact that some divisions enhance jihadi resilience is important because it helps us understand why, despite the jihadis' inability to achieve policy goals, they have managed to maintain a movement with a sustained operational capability. Understanding the nature and the impact of fault lines within and around the jihadis can therefore provide valuable lessons about how we might translate the jihadis' failure in the policy realm to the operational realm as well. Only if we can frustrate jihadi aspirations in the policy and the operational realm can we claim to overcome this threat. But on a more humble note, I think that our report also suggests that a strategy that focuses on exploiting divisions alone has its limitations and cannot defeat the jihadis on its own. It has to be nested within other CT strategies, and I think Brian is going to also talk about this in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Asaf. I think you can see through Asaf's insightful remarks, it just sort of scrapes the tip of the iceberg in terms of the depth of analysis of the full volume. I want to use the word dense in a very positive note in terms of the volume. It's very rich. I'm going to now turn to Brian Fishman. Actually, I knew Brian when we were just starting out the Combating Terrorism Center, so I can attest to his ability to let contracts, run budgets, and do all the other logistical matters necessary for running a center. He's currently the Counterterrorism Research Fellow at the New America Foundation and a Research Fellow also with the CTC. He previously served as the CTC's Director of Research and was on faculty in the Department of Social Sciences at West Point. He's been a regular contributor to the CTC's Harmony Project reports. He authored Dysfunction and Decline, Lessons Learned from Inside al-Qaeda in Iraq, co-authored al-Qaeda's Foreign Fighters in Iraq, a first look at the Sinjar records, and edited Bombers, Bank Accounts, and Bleed Out, al-Qaeda's Road in and Out of Iraq, which I think Peter Bergen contributed to as well. As part of his duties at West Point, Brian deployed to Iraq and served on the CENTCOM assessment team. He was also the founding editor of the Combating Terrorism Sentinel. He has appeared in numerous national and international media outlets. I know when he was at the Combating Terrorism Center, we kept getting calls for his insightful analysis through NPR and others, and it's a real pleasure to be able to see you again. And he holds, let me just add, he holds his master's from Columbia University. I think that's where you first met Reed Sawyer, and a BA from the University of California. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Brian.
Thank you very much, Colonel Jeb. I just, on a personal note, even before I start, it's a lot of fun for me now spending my time here at New America, which is a wonderful place, and I really enjoy working with Peter and Steve Call and the rest of the team here. But it's a lot of fun for me to be able to still maintain a connection to West Point, which is really a special place, and the CTC writ large. So it's a lot of fun to have you guys here, just personally. Before I start, I really want to thank all of the contributors to the volume. I think that you'll see as you go through that Asaf and I did our very best to sort of keep up with the intellectual horsepower that we'd recruited to write for us, but that's difficult because they did such a good job. Also, Asaf was too kind at the beginning. I mean, really, he's the guy that drove the train and did a lot of the hard work to make this thing happen, and I really do appreciate that. I've learned a lot from working with him. He is the definition of a consummate professional. I'm going to frame my comments a little bit around the topic of the day and the issue of Afghanistan, and try to discuss a little bit what some of the lessons from our report, how they may be applied to that issue and the way that we should be thinking about the problems that we face there. In the very early days after 9/11, a lot of Americans sincerely worried that al-Qaeda was a movement on the march, that this was not just a terrorist organization, but this was an organization that would be taking over countries and leading and actually posed a threat to reestablish a caliphate. People thought that. A lot of people thought that, and we framed much of our counterterrorism policy around that idea. I think that one of the things that we've learned in the years since 9/11 is that those initial fears were probably overblown. Al-Qaeda was a fringe movement on 9/11, even within its own jihadi community, even within Afghanistan. And it remains a fringe movement today. In fact, it has been pushed further to the fringes of the Islamic and Islamist worlds. The once widespread notion that al-Qaeda is going to take over countries and control polities, I think, is much reduced today. And because of that, we've sort of come to the understanding that this is not the sort of Manichaean struggle that we thought it might be one at the beginning. You cannot have a Manichaean struggle with a fringe organization. It just simply is not strong enough. We don't want to give them that much credit. So today we're rightly sort of reassessing our CT strategy in light of this new perspective on this organization. It's increasingly clear that al-Qaeda is not in a position to overturn these groups, and one of the reasons, of course, is the exogenous pressure, the outside pressure, the exogenous is the term that we're using, on this organization. It has been hammered and battered in Afghanistan, in Saudi Arabia. It had its day in Iraq and seems to be in decline, though it is still a viable militant organization there. It is hampered in its activity, in its ability to organize in the Pakistani border regions, in large part because of various forms of pressure that are applied on it. And so this is an organization that has been hurt from the outside. But at the same time, it's been weakened by its inability to win over large parts of the Islamist and jihadi communities. What I think we didn't understand on 9/11 is that there were very clear conceptions among jihadis themselves of what jihad meant, and al-Qaeda's argument for what jihad meant was different than what even many of those folks thought it meant. And so what we see today, I think, and what we oftentimes conflate with al-Qaeda specifically, is a form of jihad that actually predates al-Qaeda, and that al-Qaeda is trying to capitalize on. So part of what I think we need to be thinking about here going forward with the sort of fight against al-Qaeda is how do we limit al-Qaeda's ability to capitalize on these innate these forms of jihad with a longer lineage, is maybe a better way of putting it. This past July, a senior al-Qaeda leader named Atiya Abdul Rahman released a statement urging potential jihadis not to travel to Pakistan and Afghanistan to join al-Qaeda and fight with them against U.S. troops in Afghanistan. Why would he do that? Why would a senior al-Qaeda leader be urging people not to go to Afghanistan and fight? I think this illustrates some of the challenge for al-Qaeda. Because there are practical reasons, of course, right? There are practical reasons in that al-Qaeda is under a lot of pressure. It's very difficult to integrate these people when some random person from Yemen or Saudi Arabia or the UK shows up in the Pakistani border regions. Al-Qaeda does not necessarily have a very good way to vet that person and understand whether they're an intelligence agent or a committed jihadi. But there are other reasons that al-Qaeda might be doing this as well. And one of them is that al-Qaeda has plans for such people that are willing to mobilize that supersede its desire to see them fight in Afghanistan or Iraq. It would much rather see them fight in Yemen. It would much rather see them fight in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, in the United States, in Britain, in Germany, in a place like that. So what we see here is a tension between what Thomas Heghammer and Vahid Brown in this volume call classical jihad and global jihad. And classical jihad is the sort of form of mobilization that we think of and we associate most closely with the fight against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan during the 1980s, where essentially the grievance identified was that a foreign, quote-unquote, infidel power had invaded a, quote-unquote, Muslim land and needed to be expelled. The strategy and sort of the purpose of the mobilization was to get people to go to Afghanistan from around the world. It was a global mobilization. But the form that the activism took was essentially relatively simple and direct. It was to confront Soviet troops on the battlefield in Afghanistan, wear them out, thereby sort of exhaust the Soviet state and force them to withdraw from Afghanistan. And once they did, the movement sort of dissipated and spread out again. This is a very different idea than what al-Qaeda wants to accomplish. Al-Qaeda defines both the grievances that it is worried about and its mode of operationalization or its strategy and tactics in very different ways, right? Al-Qaeda identifies its grievances as a much broader assault rather than just a sort of military occupation of a Muslim land, but a sort of cultural imperialism, democracy itself, Britney Spears videos, et cetera, et cetera. Al-Qaeda includes all of those things as part of a coherent and cohesive war against Islam. And because it has this broader set of grievances, it also identifies a broader strategy for dealing with this, right? It focuses on attacking the United States, not only to sever its ties from local Arab regimes that al-Qaeda deems anathema, but also because it wants to weaken the United States' ability to project other forms of power into the Islamic world, cultural power, economic power, etc. This difference, the fact that the global jihadis disagree with the classical jihadis on both the grievance, but also the solution, is what Vahid Brown calls a double bind in the volume. And I think that's a useful term for understanding the sort of next evolution. The problem that al-Qaeda faces, and that Atiya Abdel-Rahman was trying to address in his July message, is that classical jihad still remains far, far, far more popular than global jihad does. And this is a problem from al-Qaeda's perspective, because al-Qaeda does have political goals, and it does want to organize people and direct them towards a particular strategy. But it has a very hard time doing that because of the emotional and ideological pull of classical jihad, of fighting in a traditional zone of jihad against armed forces in a Muslim land that they deem is occupied by an infidel, whether that's Iraq or Afghanistan, etc. So how is al-Qaeda going to deal with this problem? Well, what they've done is they've adopted what we've termed, and what others have used similar kinds of terms, hybrid jihad. And what they're trying to accomplish there is they're trying to say, look, you are mobilized by the grievance of an occupation in a quote-unquote Muslim land. But that motivation can be expressed, you can operationalize that idea by attacking in the West itself, right? So you can use the sort of classical jihadi grievance to motivate people, but then redirect them and use the fundamental sort of global jihadi strategy in order to operationalize. Now, a lot of you, I imagine, are thinking as we did, well, okay, that makes sense. Those are some nice archetypes. But in the real world, this gets a hell of a lot fuzzier. Because in the real world, al-Qaeda has always complained about occupation of Muslim lands. It's not just this sort of global set of grievances. In the real world, they have tried to drag people into Afghanistan and Iraq at various times to do all sorts of things. And that is all true. Does it even matter if in Afghanistan, if you're General Petraeus or any of our old cadets that are now platoon leaders and captains in some cases probably, and you've got an Arab suicide bomber attacking you in Khost? Does it matter whether or not they were motivated by al-Qaeda in a sense of sort of global grievance, or by the simpler grievance of the fact that there are infidel troops in a Muslim territory? And the answer is probably not. Probably doesn't matter from that perspective. But it does matter if you're trying to plan a countering violent extremism campaign outside of Afghanistan or Iraq to try to prevent people from going there in the first place. Because you've got to understand, what is it that's motivating people? Is it sort of a sense of Western cultural imperialism, or is it simply the presence of these people in these places? And I would argue that, and it seems to me that the anecdotal, and it is anecdotal, but the widespread evidence, I think, suggests that classical jihad is still by far the primary motivator for people around the world. It's the specter of troops being in those places rather than the list of grievances that al-Qaeda espouses. That's a pretty discomforting conclusion. But what it does, if we recognize that, I think, and you can actually look to a number of incidents in the West. If you look at some of these Western attacks, I'm looking at Bill Braniff because he pointed this out to me at one point. Bill works with the CTC. If you look at many of the jihadi terrorism plots in the West over the past several years, they fall into a category that I think fits a classical jihadi mode of operationalization even more so than a global jihadi sort of mode, right? And this is the hybrid jihad that al-Qaeda is trying to promote. So if you look at Major Nidal Hassan, he attacked a military base. The Fort Dix 6, they attacked a military base. We've seen a variety of different attacks on military recruiting centers. We see in many of the cases of attacks in the West or plots in the West, people that first traveled to fight abroad and then were turned around by al-Qaeda elements or jihadi elements once they got there to attack in the West. The idea being that it is the notion of occupation or the perception of occupation that is motivating these people in the first place. So that gets us to a pretty ugly place, right? So what am I suggesting? Am I saying we should walk out of these countries? No, I'm actually not saying that. But I am saying that we need to recognize a tension in our policies. And we need to have debates about future policies that is built around the tension that I'm going to try to describe here. And that is, there are many persuasive reasons from a purely counterterrorism perspective why having a presence in Afghanistan and even Iraq today is important, right? The pressure that we are applying on al-Qaeda in the Pakistani border regions is very valuable in my view. It does help prevent al-Qaeda, the organized al-Qaeda elements, from planning and strategizing and training people effectively. And I look at the Faisal Shahzad example, who wanted to set off a bomb in Times Square, as an example of this. He was able to get some training in the Pakistani border regions, but not all that much. In part, it seems, because some of the jihadis in that area didn't really trust him. They didn't have time to give him a very good training course. And when he gets back to the United States, he's not able to construct an effective bomb as a result. Right? That's a success. That's a product, in my mind, of some of the things we're trying to do in Afghanistan. The issue, though, is that our efforts in these places are reducing the ability of centralized global jihadi groups to plan and organize attacks on the West, but at the same time increasing, and I would say substantially increasing, the likelihood that we are seeing radicalization by folks in the West attempting to pull off smaller scale one-off attacks. This leaves us at a point where we have to kind of think clearly about what sort of threat are we really worried about. Are we worried about this widespread movement of people that are likely less trained, that are going to fail oftentimes when they try to blow stuff up? Or are we worried about hierarchical, traditional global jihadi groups on the al-Qaeda model, organizing and planning attacks overseas and then projecting power into the West? A second sort of form that this hybrid jihad takes is this notion and the argument that al-Qaeda has been able to make successfully with elements of the Taliban, particularly the Tehrik-i Taliban Pakistan, that their traditional sort of mode of operation of trying to evict what they consider an occupier from Muslim land needs to be supplemented by a strategy that targets the West in the West itself. And that's been very effective. Al-Qaeda has been able to do that pretty well, as we see with the TTP in Pakistan. But there are even divisions there, and I'm going to sort of transition here away from the hybrid jihadi piece just a little bit and talk about Afghanistan. There are even divisions there that we need to understand when we think about the Afghan milieu and why and how these groups interact with one another. One of the most important things that we've seen in the sort of Afghanistan-Pakistan milieu is al-Qaeda convincing the Tehrik-i Taliban Pakistan that they need to attack the Pakistani state, right? That's critically important. But al-Qaeda's arguments for attacking the Pakistani state and the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan's arguments for attacking the Pakistani state are different. And we need to understand why they're different, because they imply different things about how these groups will behave in the future. And Pakistan and the Pakistani government understands these differences. If we want to understand their behavior, we need to understand the sort of inputs that they are assessing. Right? So al-Qaeda says it is attacking the Pakistani state because it is fundamentally corrupt. It is a democratic state, despite the fact that it was founded as an Islamic state. It embraces democracy, and because it has done so, it is anathema and needs to be attacked and taken apart. Al-Qaeda's argument for attacking Pakistan has nothing to do with the U.S. presence and the coalition presence in Afghanistan. The Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan has embraced the idea of attacks against the Pakistani state, but they have not taken that full step to say that the Pakistani state fundamentally is corrupt. What they say is that the Pakistani state needs to be attacked because it is supporting the U.S. war in Afghanistan. Right? We may think that doesn't matter, but from a Pakistani perspective, that matters. Right? Because that means that they can justify to themselves, wrongly in my view, that if the U.S. walks, and the coalition walks out of Afghanistan, the TTP will stop. Right? Now, that's not the case with al-Qaeda, but they can justify that to themselves with the TTP. And I think that's part of their calculus at this point. That strikes me as wrong and simple-minded, frankly. The TTP is on a glide path that aligns with al-Qaeda, and in my view, just because they haven't sort of espoused those ideas just yet, I think it's pretty clear where they're headed. But it tells us something about Pakistan. All right, I'm going to wrap this up pretty quickly here. The next thing that I think actually provides some optimism here is that we, like many other analysts, have noted the very important element of takfir and the killing of Muslims by jihadis as a fundamental weakness. Takfir is the declaration by a Muslim that another Muslim is outside the community of believers and is therefore subject to attack. That is absolutely central and a tremendous weakness for the jihadi movement. But one of the things, Mohammed Hafez in this volume has a really tremendous chapter on takfir, and I really recommend it to all of you. He identifies that there's really two debates that go on within the jihadi movement over takfir. One is the sort of obvious question of, well, who has done things bad enough that we can excommunicate them, that we can declare that they're outside the community of believers? That's one question. But he says the second question is who in the jihadi movement is qualified to make that determination, right? It's an issue of hierarchy, right, of authority within the movement. Who has the authority to make that judgment? That's a really important question. It's very relevant for what we see across the jihadi movement today, because what we're seeing in Afghanistan, in Iraq, we saw this, and elsewhere around the world, is that lower levels of the jihadi movement are increasingly rejecting the authority of their senior leaders, right? That's a tremendously important trend going forward, because what it's doing is it's pulling the movement apart, right? Now that's good in a lot of senses, in the way that I think we're getting to a point where al-Qaeda is, and the jihadi movement writ large is increasingly less able to coordinate and centralize resources to apply them in various places. But it's tricky in a place like Afghanistan. And the reason it's tricky in a place like Afghanistan is because General Petraeus has said that the way wars like that stop is through some sort of negotiated process. And that has to date occurred with very major elements of the Taliban, and including elements of the senior element, would-be senior elements of the Quetta Shura, which Mullah Omar led. But what we see, I think, increasingly, is that senior elements in the Quetta Shura are less and less able to cut deals that actually are going to matter. And that is a dangerous trend over the long run, right? This is an argument. We are working under the assumption, our strategy seems to be that we're going to hit the Taliban very hard. We are going to force them to the negotiating table. We're going to force them to cut a deal. And trap them in institutions that are sustainable over the long run. That's a reasonable strategy. I think there's actually this trend that may be working for us, which is that senior elements of the Taliban may feel compelled they need to negotiate now while they still have authority to cut a deal. The flip side of that, though, is that if you don't get a deal soon, you may be able to cut a deal over the long run, but it may not mean that much, right? We see that with the Quetta Shura Taliban losing influence over the Tehrik-i Taliban in Pakistan. Mullah Omar urges them over and over again not to attack the Pakistani state. They do it anyway. We see that with the intransigence of Mullah Dadullah before he was killed, who adopted al-Qaeda-like tactics and rejected some of Mullah Omar's sort of exhortations to stop. And we see that more and more with reports from the field of lower-level Taliban guys that essentially have adopted al-Qaeda-style tactics and extremism. They know nothing but war and fighting, and they're not all that interested in what senior leaders like Mullah Omar have to say. The fight has become the reason. And this, to me, suggests both optimism and pessimism in a place like Afghanistan. It's very different from the situation in Iraq when things started to turn around in 2007. 2007, we saw a lot of insurgent groups in Iraq coalescing into larger factions, right? Coalitions that could make deals and could enforce them. In Afghanistan, it strikes me that the opposite trend is occurring. From a tactical and operational level, that's a good thing. From a strategic level, it may not be. Okay. Just a couple of quick points on sort of specific recommendations, and then we should go to questions. We can never highlight al-Qaeda's tendency to kill Muslims enough, and we need to do that as often as possible. And the great benefit is that we don't have to make anything up or exaggerate because they are actually doing all of these terrible things. This is something I think we need to keep in mind whether there is an attack abroad or even if there is an attack in the United States or the West. Oftentimes in the wake of an attack in the West, we tend to focus on the apparent religious identity of the attacker when really we need to be focusing on the victims, right? And highlighting the sort of the pluralism, religious pluralism of the victims, and in particular, any Muslim victims that there may be, as there almost certainly will be in a large-scale attack in the West. We need to think about those instances as opportunities to weaken al-Qaeda and the jihadis strategically. We need to tailor CVE campaigns for very specific audiences. Right? We can't rely in particular on recantations by jihadi figures as if they are going to apply to everyone equally. They're not. They're going to apply to specific countries where particular leaders were effective. They're going to apply on particular issues where certain individuals had made important ideological arguments in the past. Lastly, and we've got a list of suggestions and recommendations at the end of the report, which I'm sure you can pore over and tear apart. But lastly, I think we need to recognize that the anonymity of the internet can be an advantage. And we need to think about how we disrupt communications. When jihadi groups can't communicate, there is discord among them. And I think a primary example of that is with al-Qaeda Central to its agents in Iraq. We often think of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's intransigence as sort of a personal unwillingness to take instruction, and I think that's true to an extent, but it's also a function of the fact that he didn't get very clear instructions for a long time because communication was difficult, to put it simply. We can use the anonymity of the internet to increase paranoia among jihadi groups by making them believe, even when we do not, that we control websites and that we have very fancy surveillance techniques. That is something we should do. Right? So when it was revealed last year that that a major jihadi website was actually a honeypot website controlled by intelligence agencies, that's great. It's great that it gets discovered, right? There are some folks, I'm sure, that are sad that that gets lost as is no longer an intelligence tool, and that's fair. But from a strategic communications perspective, that's a win because that makes all of the jihadis sort of look over their shoulder or look over their keyboard, as it were, as when they're trying to communicate with each other. We should think about those things in different ways. It's not just a setback. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. What I'd like to do before I throw it open to questions is just share with you a quote from Bruce Hoffman, in congressional testimony that I think really does a great job situating the importance of this line of study and its implications for counterterrorism policy, as Asaf and Brian have laid out. He says, all terrorist movements throughout history have presented themselves as monoliths, united and in agreement over fundamental objectives, aims, strategies, tactics, and targets. Too often their opponents succumb to such fictions and therefore fail to seize a critical opportunity to identify and exploit opportunities by deepening existing and creating new sources of dissension, widening emergent ideological fault lines, and driving wedges within movements based on internal disagreements. This approach of undermining terrorist groups from within has arguably been missing from the current conduct of the war on terrorism. So thank you very much for laying that out. What I'd like to do is turn it over to the audience. Yes, sir. With the right in the front, second row.
Phil, have a mic.
And if you would, this is filmed, so if you would wait for the mic, that would be much appreciated.
Mark Katz from George Mason University and Middle East Policy Council. I'd like to congratulate you on a really tremendous presentation, really tremendous study. Looking forward to reading it, and I'll assign it to my graduate students next semester, very definitely. The presentation, though, the discussion of disputes among the jihadis, reminds me very much 30 years ago, the specialist community on Soviet Third World relations, which I was part of, knew very well that there were differences, severe differences between the Soviets and their Marxist allies in different parts of the world, and that this offered, opportunities for the U.S. to take advantage of. But the policymaking community resisted this message, the congressional community resisted it even more, and the general public was simply unwilling to accept this message. And I would rather imagine that you gentlemen are going to face the very same problem, that the idea that the jihadis disagree with each other. Are you dupes? Are you fools? I think that, or that to the extent that they do disagree with each other, what does it matter? They agree on far more than they disagree upon. It strikes me that certainly the quote that you made from Bruce Hoffman at the very end, was at the very heart of our problem, 30 years ago. But then, of course, the problem basically resolved itself. How do you overcome this problem? How do you convince policymakers, politicians, who may in fact know better, but for whom it's very difficult to sign on to your viewpoint because, in fact, there's tremendous resistance to it within the public at large? Thank you.
I don't know that I have a good answer for you, but I think that I think that we certainly at the CTC have been doing our best. Actually, most of the reports for which the CTC is well known have attempted to actually highlight this particular fact that the jihadis are internally divided. I would agree with you. It's shocking the extent to which, to most people, that still seems to be something that is news. So I don't have a good answer for you, but agreeing with you, we set out to do this report, in the hope that by sending it out to the world, and by hoping that it will, spread virally, that we will hopefully be able, if not to push the envelope, at least to push the debate a little bit forward. But I appreciate your comments. I just don't have a good.
I think that there are instances, though, where we have recognized this and we've made it work. And the most prominent of those was during the sort of surge strategy in Iraq, where we for a long time in Iraq looked at the environment and we looked at all of these insurgents, many of whom were saying very similar things on the surface and whose tactics were very similar in a lot of ways. Everybody was killing Americans. And what we did ultimately was we stepped back and we said, well, why are all of these people doing this? And they're doing it for very different reasons. And some of those reasons can be co-opted, and some of those people can be bought off, and some of those people can be integrated, and some of those people can't be. And what we're saying here, I think, is very much to say, look, we can apply the strategy of the surge to the global jihadi movement writ large, or at least the mode of thinking that worked in the surge is probably a better way to put it, not rather than the strategy.
Yes, sir, right. Yes.
Hugh McElrath, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Let me add my applause to the disciplined and precise analysis that's in the report and in this presentation. And at the risk of fuzzing it, you mentioned differences with this sort of other focused movements of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, Hezbollah. Could you address Lashkar-e-Taiba and the struggle against the Hindu enemy?
So first of all, I mean, I would situate Lashkar-e-Taiba as a group that is probably associated with the jihadi movement. I wouldn't. Now, let me also say that, of course, the jihadis, they are Islamists as well. So we define Islamism actually pretty broadly as Islamic activism. So the fact that we labeled the MB or Hamas or Hezbollah as Islamists, we didn't mean to actually beautify them or anything. So are you referring kind of to tensions between jihadis versus Lashkar-e-Taiba? Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, I would argue that they would probably fit more in the context of inter-jihadi divisions. Lashkar-e-Taiba, I think, is an interesting example of a group that has, I think, adopted in the course of the years a growing number of elements of jihadi ideology. But at the same time, I think that one interesting potential division that we might see here is that with the Mumbai attacks, Lashkar-e-Taiba has, perhaps kind of set a mode, a new tactical mode, which al-Qaida might want to adopt down along the lines. So I guess my short answer would be probably that I can see certain competition between al-Qaida and the LET, mainly on the basis of perhaps tactical or on operational grounds. I'm not sure.
When I think about LET, I think about it as a prime example of this trend where we see lower level folks rejecting their higher ups, and I think that what we're going to see with LET is that the bottom is being pulled out from its senior leaders by al-Qaida. And it is attracting more and more LET people to its ideology. And so my expectation is that the leadership of LET will maintain its links to the Pakistani state and in many ways loyalty to the Pakistani state as it has for years, but that major elements from the LET are likely to be co-opted by al-Qaida and its ideology. I think this is, perhaps more than any other, al-Qaeda's greatest strength is its ability to reach into other militant groups and pull people to its mode of thinking.
Yes.
Mark Stout, Johns Hopkins. The Sunni jihadist movement, at least as the people who are in it today look back and understand it, has been around for quite some time. I mean, Abu Musab al-Suri at least has it going back to the mid-'60s at any rate. And over that time period, of course, lots of individual groups have come and gone, but the movement persists. Now, you've done a great job here, and I'm really looking forward to actually reading the book, of talking about the endogenous predicaments and the exogenous pressures. I guess the question I have for you is, given all of this, do you think that this Sunni jihadist movement is an evolutionary dead end, or alternately, is Darwin really at work here? And if so, are we in 20 or 30 years, or whatever it is you want to define as the long run, going to see groups that are more fitted to their environment, whether that's in terms of having actually greater capabilities, or maybe just brilliant at operating under the radar and persisting without really annoying anybody too much? What's the long run? Are you ultimately predicting extinction, or are you predicting better fitness of these groups in the out years?
Yeah. That's a great question, and for those of you that don't know Mark Stout's work, he's got a great blog, which I can't remember it now. On War and Words, which is really worth reading, actually. It's a lot of thoughtful pieces. The post that you put up recently, the book by Abu Jihad al-Shami, gets at a lot of these issues, I think. My view is that the global jihadi movement as it is today is essentially working its way towards extinction or something close to it. Right, because there are sort of intractable ideological positions that the movement takes that I think limit its ability to evolve. And when we see this group, we see over and over and over again jihadi groups making the exact same mistakes. And those mistakes usually are killing way too many Muslims and angering people and provoking a backlash. And then you see folks pop up every once in a while, like an Abu Musab al-Suri or like a Harun Fazl or somebody like this that has a more strategic way of looking at the world. And those people tend to be effective operators, but we don't see those people rising to leadership positions. In many ways, I think if a jihadi group is actually going to sort of meld itself to a society and become more functional and effective, it's giving up what makes it a frightening jihadi group. And it's becoming something, and I certainly don't want to minimize the danger that a group like Hamas poses, but it's becoming a group like Hamas that is much more contained in its sort of scope and effort, right? And that's dangerous, especially to sort of its local enemy, but not necessarily to the global system as we think about it today.
So, this reminded me of David Rappaport. Your question, Mark, reminded me of David Rappaport's article. He looks at these 4 waves of modern terrorism, and so he has the first 3 waves: the anarchist wave, the anti-colonial wave, and the new left wave. And then he asks the question. He says that we're now in this 4th wave, this religious wave of terrorism. And if the first 3 waves are any indication, that perhaps, he asks the question, he doesn't really answer it, will we see an end to this religious wave also after like 1 or 2 generations? So if these first, if the first 3 of these waves are an indication, then perhaps we will see an end to the general trend of jihadi terrorism. But when it comes actually to the motives that give rise to this sort of terrorism, to terrorism that is actually motivated by a religious ideology, I'm a bit more skeptical, because I do think that even though I don't call this a religious terrorism per se, but I think of the jihadis more as groups that are bound by a religious ideology, but still they use some of the same religious religious statements and religious doctrine that many Muslims use. So religion, in other words, has been a very, very powerful force, for time immemorial. It is very similar in some ways to nationalism, right? So nationalism is, you see certain waves of nationalism, but it never really goes away. And so I think that the same thing is arguably true for religiously inspired terrorism. We may see a decline in this trend, but will it go away completely? I don't think so.
Yes, a gentleman in the back.
Good morning. I'm Matul Singh, founder and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer, which is a new publication covering global issues, and I did special operations pre-9/11 in Kashmir. So the question I have, and I like the fact that you said that the global jihadi movement might be in its death throes, is born out of my experience. And we in India saw a more unified structure in Kashmir dismember into many disparate elements and become a hydra-headed monster. And that has been the record. If you go back historically, you look at the British Empire, you look at any empire, you look at that as fundamentally the record of terrorist groups. And Colonel Jeb was very, very apt in bringing that quote of terrorist groups presenting a unified face, but in reality being a hydra-headed monster. My question to you is this. Given the fact that you see disintegration, given the fact that you see these groups evolving into regional or more disparate actors, what is the fundamental nature of strategy that the US will need to follow, both military and intelligence, and what is the fundamental change that will need to bring about to be safer? And I know it's a broad, overarching question, but one of the things that often is left out is the elephant in the room, and the elephant in the room is the fact that you have terror in places like Afghanistan and in places like Pakistan because they present a unique combination of a failed state, primitive societies, and collusion in state structures. Now, how do you tackle things like that? Thank you.
Who would like to take that
You
one?
want that one?
So, since we received a broad question, let me give you a broad answer. Counterterrorism policy, of course, it's a constellation of a lot of different elements, and one of the things that we try to highlight in our report is that, just because we focused on the jihadis' internal divisions doesn't mean that this is where we think that the main thrust of counterterrorism policy has to be extended. We do, as both of us mentioned, we think that it has to be nested within a larger, constellation of elements. And here, I don't think I need to go. People like Paul Pilar and others have done a fantastic job, kind of laying out the elements of counterterrorism policy. But I think that you're really kind of getting at the questions of grievances, as well as weak states. And I think that. It's important to kind of think about this a short-term CT battle and a long-term CT battle, and I think that in the short term, there are things that we need to do which will not necessarily appear to be very, very nice on our behalf. We need to exploit divisions. We need to kill people. We need to kill people or arrest people in the senior leadership. So I think that these are things that are necessary to remove the immediate threat, but I think that we would fool ourselves if we would believe that this is going to. So I agree with you that we would fool ourselves thinking that this would actually eliminate the problem at large. The Israelis erected a barrier, and it stopped suicide terrorism in the short term, but of course it didn't really put an end to the grievances that give rise to suicide bombs. Right. Yes. So so I don't know exactly how to do it. I don't know how to remove a person's humiliation, but I do know that it's worth expending efforts into understanding and trying to think about how to do it. So yes, grievances and addressing grievances and problems of failed states all have to be part of a counterterrorism policy.
This is on the top of my mind because looking at this from a very American perspective, but I've been teaching a class at Georgetown on insurgency, and one of the things that my students were really interested in is this idea that sort of John Nagel resurrects in his book, Learning to Eat Soup with a Knife, right? Which is that Americans go to war and they think about it in very binary terms. Either we're going to fight or we're not going to fight, and we're either going to win or we're going to lose. And the reality is that most people around the world don't think about it that way. Right? They think about problems that can be managed over the long run. I mean, the Iranians are not trying to win in Iraq. They're just trying to manage Iraq so that it suits their interests. And they're doing the same thing in Afghanistan. And I think Karzai is probably looking at things very similarly today in Afghanistan. And certainly the Pakistanis have been playing that game of management for 60 years, right? And I think we've got to understand that we're not going to get to a point where it's over. And we walk because nobody else around the world is looking at it. I mean, maybe some of our, in particular European allies are thinking about it that way, but nobody else is. And the question we've got to ask ourselves is how much do we want to invest in managing these problems, and how do we do that over the long run? I'll be very blunt. I think that there are very good arguments again for some of the sort of short-term strategy that from what I understand of the new strategy announced today in Afghanistan. But over the long run, maintaining a major presence in a place like Afghanistan is going to increase the number of jihadis that are targeting Americans, because classical jihad is still the primary mode of sort of mobilization for jihadis today, and that's just a fact. Now that may be it may be right to sort of deal with that and accept that in the short run. But over the long run, you're not going to be able to sort of beat the jihadi movement in the sense, from an American perspective, that we're going to reduce the threat to the American homeland and American interests while maintaining major presence there. And I think that's a discomforting reality, but I think it's a reality.
Yes, sir.
My name's Kevin Landy. I'm actually about to start a job at Department of Homeland Security. Thank you. I'm actually focused on, I'm interested in Iraq and particularly how al-Qa'ida views Iran and the danger that Iran might be increasing its influence in Iraq and in concert with potentially a Shiite-dominated government in Iraq. I don't know to what extent al-Qaeda has been marginalized now there, and to what extent really it's a problem of factionalism between the Sunnis and the Shiites in Iraq. But do you see a possibility that al-Qaeda might return and see Iranian influence in some way as an occupation by infidels or by not the true believers?
Absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt that al-Qaeda sees Iranian influence in Iraq as an occupation and an unjust one, and that is still a very resonant issue for them as they try to persuade Ba'athist and other groups that they should collaborate with al-Qaeda in Iraq, or the Islamic State of Iraq, which is still there. And it's still, Iraq is, the first 6 months of this year, National Counterterrorism Center recorded more terrorist incidents in Iraq than Afghanistan. Now that's switched since June, but that's pretty striking, actually, when you think about it. One of the things that I think we point to, we don't spend a lot of time on it, is that, of course, al-Qaeda and the Iranian regime are fundamentally strategic enemies, but that doesn't mean that there aren't instances where elements of the Iranian regime might be willing to work with elements of al-Qaeda. And we should be very wary of those sorts of things, and we shouldn't just disregard them. We also shouldn't jump on those things as illustrations and justifications for all sorts of crazy policies, which sometimes we want to do. But we should not put up any sort of analytical frames that don't allow us to see reality.
And I mean, I would just add another example. Of course, Iranian support of Hamas is just another example of how pragmatism oftentimes trumps, supposedly sectarian divisions.
Do you have any more questions? If not, I actually have a question. In the report, it talked a lot about divisions stemming from the mismatch of words and deeds. And one of those issues had to do with the rhetoric against Israel, but yet no attacks in Israel. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that and why that hasn't occurred.
Mm-hmm. I mean, sir, I think that failure on the part of al-Qaeda. Well, first of all, I mean, there have been a couple of attacks against Israeli targets, or at least targets that were identified with Israel. Certainly, on the part of affiliates, there's been an attack on the Israeli embassy in Mauritania by AQIM. The Kenya attack, attacks on synagogues in Istanbul, Jerba synagogue, and so forth. So there have been. And al-Qaeda really doesn't make a distinction so much between Israel and the Jews. They're just all Zionists, and they're all kind of under this one. I think that probably the main challenge for al-Qaeda, and the main reason why it hasn't why it hasn't successfully kind of attacked Israel is probably has to do with Israeli defenses. There is no issue that I think would help Al-Qaeda more than a successful, spectacular attack in Israel. Obviously, it's an issue that has the ability to rally the big chunks of the Muslim community, and so certainly I think that efforts are extended, but there are real concrete hurdles to achieving that end.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Asaf. The one thing I would point out is that there was a rocket attack in 2006 from southern Lebanon that was claimed by an al-Qaeda affiliate. The other piece to that I think is notable, and that we talk about a little bit in the report, is the fact that al-Qaeda wants to sort of seize the war against Israel as a strategic talking point for itself, but it has a hard time doing that because it doesn't do anything. And one of the reasons why it doesn't do anything is that jihadi groups have tried to build, Salafi jihadi organizations in Gaza and the West Bank, and existing Palestinian organizations like Hamas don't want any part of it, right? Which is not to say that Hamas are a bunch of nice guys, not by a long shot, but they are a group that doesn't want that values a certain sense of legitimacy among elements in the international community, whether they're in the Arab world or Europe, and doesn't want to be lumped into the same group as al-Qaeda. And so we saw 2008. Am I getting my dates right? I don't remember. A real Hamas crackdown against Salafi mosques in Gaza that inflamed the jihadi world. And we see real tension there between al-Qa'ida and Hamas globally. Reuven Paz wrote a chapter in the report discussing some of this, which I think is interesting. One of Reuven's findings, which I did not know and didn't fully understand, is that some of the sort of Salafi/jihadi organization in the Palestinian territories is not really Salafi jihadi organization in the Palestinian territories. It's smuggling families that don't like Hamas, which has monopolized smuggling, and they need something to hang their hat on. So they've sort of latched on to jihadism, right? Which is interesting. And I think that just sort of goes to show you how people come to this ideology.
Thank you. If we don't have any more questions, what I'd like to do is turn it over to you all if you have any concluding thoughts before we close.
Actually, no. I mean, I just one of our hopes was really kind of to spark additional inquiries along these lines, and so we just hope that that this report is going to help generate additional questions. We are under no delusion that we have successfully answered all of these difficult questions that we posed, but we try to pose the really hard questions, and so we hope that hopefully more research is going to be generated out of that report.
Thank you very much.
As you can, before I just wanted to mention, I have the best job ever because I get to bask in the glow of the success of just tremendously talented, gifted, and dedicated professionals. So this has been a great treat for me. Now let's give them a hand.